Terrillian, Podcast 6, The Dawasil. Having resisted the wrath of the cursed bride, the Darthmar made their return to their holy place. They marched down into the cavities below the outer shell, down into the forbidden caves, and into their birthplace and home, into their temple fortress that holds the source of all their power. Within the temple's walls was the grave of Kraith, the cradle of Kaf, and all the substance of the universe encapsulated in a heaving, sludge-like black matter, what the 13 called the Dawasil. The Dawasil was a physical manifestation of the perfusive remnants of Kraith's power, which dwelt in all living beings. As the 13 made their approach, Kaf reached into it, and he watched as a familiar power washed over him. He felt it leave those who died and diffuse out, spreading across the world as it almost instinctively sought out to return here to the Dawasil. He could feel and see the power and the knowledge of all who had perished in almost innumerable quantities. He then drew back from the power, and the 13 relaxed in their hidden sanctum, tucked away from those they ruled over, impossible to find unless invited. Kaf then comforted his brothers, saying that they had done their task set out by their father, but they should remain ever vigilant. Welcome to the Terrillian Podcast, where we talk about the magnificent world of Terrillian, created by Ian, who joins us today as a co-host to talk about Chapter 6, The Dawasil.
Hello.
Our other co-host is Chris, our media manager and music producer, whose music you also can hear playing in the background.
Thanks, Beard.
You're welcome. I have to stumble over something. And then next we have Marina, our producer, which is just a fancy way to say that she's the other half to all of our brains and keeps us on track and motivated.
Hey.
And finally, I am Beard, your resident book nerd and lover of all things science fiction and fantasy.
Nice cover.
Thanks.
So, Ian, as we get started here, why are the caves forbidden?
Well, not all the caves would be forbidden in the world, but that specific one that leads to, the graveyard of Kraith / the birthplace of the Darthmar race, that place would definitely be a restricted area for anyone who wasn't part of the original, group that came out of there. Just because that place is essentially their foundry. That's where all their power is manifested in a physical form. So for them, that'd be something that they definitely protect and keep under very much so watch and guard.
Now, you say that it's protected. Is it protected by the Darthmar, or did they create something to protect it?
So the Dawasil itself is the embodiment of creation. So using it, which Kaf was one of the few who could utilize it in this way, but he was able to make creations that would basically stay guard and couldn't leave the Dawasil. And you get a whole birth of different characters known, some of them called the Dagroth. There's a video on YouTube on it. The Dagroth kind of all stay around the Dawasil and they don't really ever leave it.
That's interesting. Like, they don't ever leave it, or they can't leave it?
They can. They rely on it.
That's actually super fascinating, because as we were talking, it made me think of another book series by James Islington. It's a fantasy series, and there's actually a being of people that are infused with one of the forms of power within that realm, and they also cannot leave that area. So I just have this mental picture of these flame-like beings, but since the Dawasil is like a dark matter, it's actually, instead of flame-like beings, it would be like these dark, shadowy creatures. That
so
are
they would
constantly
stay
standing
around
there.
the Dawasil. So if someone came in there who wasn't a Darthmar, because they look at the Darthmar like they look at themselves. They don't see anything different between the two, so they wouldn't go after a Darthmar if it walked down there. But if they saw like a regular inhabitant trying to walk to the Dawasil, they would immediately attack. So they wouldn't allow anybody really near that.
Is that an attack to kill them, or attack to be like, hey, you should stay away, because if you go in here, you will die because you can't handle it?
Yeah, it's attack to kill for them. There's no in between. There's no buffer there. You don't get a warning. They're on you immediately. And then there's a whole different hierarchy system within that race itself.
Right.
So you have some that are more along the lines of, they help kind of, I guess you could say, control the race itself, but you also have the more aggressive ones that are like kind of like, ants have, worker ants, and you have, actual guard ants. You have the same kind of hierarchy system within their little cluster that forms around the Dawasil.
Nice. What exactly does I know, because I know we've talked about this, and you're slightly vague, and I do like that idea of keeping it vague, but how exactly does the Dawasil power work?
So all creation came from Kraith.
Right.
So when creation has met the end of its use, it returns back to Kraith. However, since Kraith has passed away, it goes back to the last remnants of his body, which would be the largest amount of Kraith there. So it would all return back to him, and since he's already gone through decomposition and he's already starting to just kind of puddle in where he is, all death, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, basically anything created, when it passes, it returns back to its creator. So it goes back to the Dawasil.
Is it a straight line, or like does it spread out slightly?
It would spread out kind of like a kind of like a plume when somebody would die. It would kind of spread out that essence, but it eventually would all filter back straight to the Dawasil. Kind of like with rain and water. When a person dies, the water in their body eventually gets disseminated, and then it gets soaked up into the soil, and then the soil evaporates off that, and it goes back into the clouds.
Well, I guess then that begs the question. Then, does that mean eventually can life survive on Terrillian without his power?
It can, because it will basically, kind of like you have reproduction, you have that ability for them to make more of themselves, but it's all through Kraith yielding that ability to them inherently.
Oh, okay.
So when they pass away, it will immediately go back to him. So their ancestors who passed away will go back to him, but they will also circulate through their children.
So what exactly the power in all things? What exactly does that mean then? And then what's the difference between having it and then not having it in the future?
So having the power doesn't mean that you don't have Kraith's creation in you, because you do, because you're alive. So obviously you've been created by something. But access to it and being able to utilize it is completely different. Okay. So being able to utilize...
So basically, like, as time goes on, there'll be less and less individuals that are capable of using the Dawasil.
Yeah, because it only comes from his direct bloodlines.
Okay.
So the people who were already on the planet when the planet was initially formed, those guys don't have the ability to utilize the Dawasil. But the Darthmar who came from it have a direct correlation to it, thus they are able to actually utilize it. So they can use the Dawasil to strengthen themselves or create something new.
Okay.
So with the Dawasil, can you tell me how much power Kaf is able to take in? How does he do it? Like, can you explain that process?
So the process is kind of blurred, and again, intentionally blurred, because I didn't want it to be so cookie cutter, and that's kind of something I like to lean on, especially when referring to stuff like the Dawasil, because I want it to have that mysterious draw to it. But the Dawasil can be accessed in multiple ways, both in a physical format and, for lack of a better word, almost like a magical format. So it does allow you to draw upon it in the way that there's later on in the story, as kind of things progress, people start to develop certain skills, like the idea of warping, where death is something that allows them to have that burst of life that returns back to the Dawasil, and they start to realize that death can actually draw off the Dawasil. So they start realizing if they can send it back, they can draw back off of it. So there's this process called warping for people who weren't naturally inherent with the ability to access the Dawasil, and they start utilizing its power. And power can be anything, which it could be strengthening of the person's body physically to make them stupid strong, or it can be like augmentation to where their body eventually grows, either like wings or claws, or you name it, something can happen. Because since it is such an X, chemical X from Powerpuff Girls, it does have the ability to affect any individual in a different way. So some makes it bigger, some make it smaller, some make you go mad.
Is there a downside to warping?
Yes, physical augmentation is the hard part, because warping would allow you to push the power out to use it to do something as simple as like a flame spell or something like that, where it would allow you to access that. But warping by its name makes your body warped. Your body would be the catalyst for death, and holding that much death in you eventually would warp your character and cause them to start to degrade.
So you've kind of mentioned it, like some people might be able to see this or might get access to it, or your character, right? So I feel like we're hinting a little bit towards the game.
Yeah.
Is there thoughts into how this is going to play into the game to the actual character? Are they going to be able to see it, access it? Is it one of those scenarios where they just learn more information, or can they actually acquire that power and use it for something?
So the game would allow, or the Dawasil would allow for a gameplay perspective. It was my idea of making a magic system. Like most good games, like have a magic system in there, and then people kind of just take it for what it is. Like, oh yeah, I have magical ability, but they don't really ask where it comes from. This is me giving magical ability a backstory. This is me allowing the characters to have a magical history to where like, okay, that's where magic came from. That's how magic came into this world. And it allows basically people to access it. For the game's sake, I just thought magic was just so abused in the modern norm. I called it burnin', which was just what I just came up with it at the time, and I just kind of ran with it from there. But it all stems off the Dawasil, allowing your characters to lean towards different kinds of prowess, which would be maybe some could be conjuring, where you'd be able to actually make something out of like a rock or a rock golem, and some would be like pyromancy, where you have the ability to access flames and being able to work with pyromancy in that respect. But it basically allowed me to have the source of Kraith's power, the source of Kath's power, and the Darthmaric power there, but also allow the player to utilize it in a magic game system. But I wanted it to be really rare, where if you met somebody who had like pyromancy or something like that, then you'd be like, oh crap, this guy's actually really strong, because that's not something you would see on your regular bandit or your regular thief or something along those lines.
Were you intending to have the power of the Dawasil be a soft magic system or a hard magic system? Like, have you sat down and created a graphed out system of how much power does X, Y, Z, or do you want it to be soft and kind of like left to your imagination to a degree how it works?
I do like the idea where with Morrowind you had the ability to like literally combine every spell that you ever learned into one stupid spell, to where like it would just be OP and it would just kill everything in its path, or it would summon like a ridiculous amount of monsters that would cause the whole game to lag. And I love that, and that would be kind of the soft system for it.
But you'd have to build experience.
Yeah, you have
And
to build
time.
experience to actually access that OP-ness. I think the biggest issue in a lot of video games nowadays is they put caps on things, or they put leveling on things. And I just think that's stupid, because nothing brought me more joy than causing a game to lag out because my character was just so awesome. And like that was literally just like the best feeling ever. So I think when people removed that from games, they took out that really special part that made the game enjoyable, being able to literally what they call break the game by just getting your character to a certain level. And I didn't want to do that to, Terrillian, so I wanted that to be a feature where you really could make spells that were so powerful that your physical game engine couldn't handle it.
Yeah, I appreciate that whole, I hate level caps on things.
It's
as
the
well.
stupidest thing.
The thing I think of right now off the top of my head is the Witcher 3 game. Because, you're a Witcher, you're a trained soldier, but there's obviously, because it's a RPG, there's a leveling system, so you can unlock X, Y, and Z. But there are swords that are locked behind a leveling system. And I'm like, I'm a Witcher. I know how to use swords. What do you mean I cannot use this sword?
Yeah.
That is so dumb.
And like that's the thing, again, like one of my all-time favorite games is Morrowind. And that was one of the things I loved about Morrowind, because if you figured out a way to take on some really OP character and you kill that OP character, you get his items.
Yeah.
You get all these fancy items that your character might be a level 1, and you stood in a corner that he couldn't reach you, and you shot arrows, like 1,000 arrows into this one guy. And you finally kill him, and you get this OP armor. And you're like, I put in the time, I put in the work. Yeah, I cheated the system, but I still got some amazing stuff out of it.
That's half the fun of games. Is
That's
figuring
half
out
the fun.
To cheat the system.
That's why people like D&D so much. Half the fun of playing D&D is trying to like break the campaign.
Yeah.
That's why people enjoy it.
That's why people hate playing with me.
Yeah, exactly. It's just
So-
pure chaos.
So we've talked about not having a cap though, but are there going to be enough battles, quests, enemies, whatever, where you're going to be the strongest person? So you technically, that is somewhat of a cap, right? Like you can only gain so much experience. Or is there going to be new content always that like, hey, here's this that you can, unless you're this level, then you can beat it and then you can acquire this level or this experience or something, right? Like maybe there could be a unique spin to it, right? So you never get capped, but you can actually always acquire new abilities and skills.
So a lot of people, what they do, and I don't appreciate this particular style, is where they do leveling with the character. But a way you can get around having an OP character, like your character gets so strong he can beat anybody, right? You just increase the amount of players against him. Instead of increasing the strength of the characters, which you can do, you can make unique characters, but after a while, you run into that whole thing that Skyrim had, where it was like, what was it? It was journeyman, or it had
adept, journeyman.
Yeah, it was like bandit,
something.
journeyman, highwayman.
Oh, that, yes.
It would just level it up, but it was the same dude, but all he would have is a better item to fight you against. And it's just like some bandit who literally, he's like scrounging for food, and he's carrying this like green glass sword, which is like worth more than the entire place he lives in. And you're like, how does that make sense? It doesn't. So what you do, instead of having like a bunch of these, like 4 of these guys who are really strong, you just increase the quantity of guys. And then you can start, like, I've always thought of having a tactical engine in the game where people would actually ambush you tactically, where you'd have archers behind you, archers in front of you, and swordsmen in front of you that are attacking you, to where it would actually be harder for you to win because you have these multiple approaches that are going to be attacking you at the same time.
Another way of checking the power of, well, not even the power, but the ability of the player to just steamroll over everything is to make the player a bit of a glass cannon. I don't know if you're familiar with that saying. Mm-hmm. So like you can level up your skill in this one thing. So it's like 999 over what does it mean? Over 9,000, whatever.
Yeah.
Over 9,000.
Over 9,000. Like you can level it up to that point, but you're still a squishy human being.
To where your health bar is still at its percentage.
Yeah. So if someone were to like hit you right in the head with the sword, you're dead. Unless you've cast a spell to protect yourself from that.
Or you heal like before it drops you down.
Or something like that.
Or epic armor.
Epic armor.
Yeah. There we go. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's ways that you can circumvent the cap system and make it to where it's still fun. Because honestly, at the end of the day, when you get to the point where you're really, really strong with the character, the last thing you want to do is go fight some random bandit who you should be able to demolish.
Yeah. And
he just kicks your ass. And you're just like, wait, why? Like, how? Like, that makes no sense to me.
Sure. Well, and I appreciate this conversation because I know we've talked about like the Dawasil and like how much power you can get, right? So I kind of want to bring us back to the reading.
Yeah.
But with Kaf, we read where he comforted his brothers. They had done their task, right? They had defended their home. They had defended everything.
Yeah.
So, but there was that one line that I heard that they should remain ever vigilant. Does Kaf know there's going to be more threats, or is this just instinctive? I kind of want to get a little bit more understanding of Kaf, right? Like, is he proud in the sense of Terrillian, or is he more like a really strong leader, right? Where he's always like got his defenses up, want to make sure everything's safe. Like, can you kind of go into that part?
Yeah, so we talked about in the last episode of the episode before last, where we talked about how he was able to remember bits and pieces of his like Kraith's memory. So he knows Kraith was struck down. He doesn't understand how, but he knows he was struck down. So he knows there's a power out there stronger than them, or something along those lines that took him out. So he knows to be ever vigilant. Not to mention, ever vigilance would also just kind of imply that we're in domain of this planet, and there's always a constant power grab between people who are getting stronger and like, I want to take over. There's always going to be that flux where you're having to deal with so many people, but the main point of that statement, I would think, would be in relationship to the fact that he knows that Kraith was struck down. Kraith didn't die of old age. Kraith didn't pass away. Kraith was struck down. So whatever struck him down still exists. Because obviously, Kraith is the only one there.
Yeah, and then in the previous chapter, they fend off... We should have asked this last week. Did they see Terrillian when they fended her off?
It was more like, imagine an asteroid coming to a planet and they took it out.
Okay.
So I didn't want them to have a real direct relationship with Terrillian until later on. Like, I'm talking like game 4, if this ever gets there. Hopefully with support it would be. But
support our emergence.
Support our emergence, please. But no, I always kind of wanted Terrillian to be the big bad end all of the game. I didn't want her to be shown off out the gate, because then you kind of lose that mystery of who she is. I want you to get tastes of her. I want you to get little bits and pieces, but I don't want you to get to see her until the end. I mean, within Lord of the Rings, they did, as far as the movie goes, show you who the bad guy was, but the characters in the movie never really interacted with him, apart from Frodo having his brief interactions.
Yeah, bits and pieces.
Yeah, bits and pieces, and you have those little flashes.
And those are great bits and pieces because you see how terrifying he is.
You see, exactly. It terrifies Gandalf. It terrifies, Frodo. It terrifies Pippin when he has his interaction. And even Aragorn when he picks up, the Planthier, I think is what it's called. Plantier or something like that. He picks it up and, the eye forms and whatnot. Like you have these little glimpses of the big bad, but you don't have an interaction in a heavy sense. I think Peter Jackson actually did have a little clip where they had him show up. They didn't put it in the actual
deleted
production.
scene. They swapped it out with the troll.
Yeah, they swapped it out with the troll, but they didn't have a scene where they showed up, and they just felt like they lost a lot of that fear that you built up. Like, really think about it. He never makes it back. As far as Lord of the Rings go, the big bad never shows up because everything up to that point is to prevent that. So when they finally take out the eye and all that, and they cast the ring of fire, that ends it. But you have that level of fear that your characters get to play out through the entire thing, where they're just afraid of this big bad showing up because he's just that powerful.
That is so epic. And even when I reflect on it too, I seem to like Kaf more and more, just because he's never. I mean, it's like he is proud. He is a really good leader, but he's supporting his brothers, right? He doesn't want his place to get defeated. He's defending his place, right? So I don't know. I appreciate that reading because he's always being able to. Seems to have that kind of foresight, right? Like, we are not going to get defeated. We're going to defend this place, all that good stuff too. So, is there any more about Kaf and like his tribe, right? His brothers that you can kind of maybe shed some more light on?
Like a camaraderie between them?
Yeah.
So they all have...
what's the influences from that and everything?
They all have almost like a twin-like bond between each other because technically they're all pretty much born around the same time frame. Apart from Kaf, who came just a little bit ahead of everybody else, but they all came from the same portion, So there is a level of brotherhood in that. However, the relationship, when your character comes into play, the relationship between all of them is super fragmented because they all basically scurried away, which we'll get into why later on, but they all scurry away because they basically get bested. Kaf gets, taken, and he has his betrayal, which again we'll go into, not to spoil too much ahead. But
spoilers,
rules. Sorry, but not to spoil too much ahead. But there is a kind of the whole concept: what happens to a snake when you remove its head? The rest of it falls apart. That kind of happens in the whole storyboard with them, as far as the Darthmaric race.
Interesting.
Okay. Now, to talk more about the Darthmar, do each of them inside the empire of the Darthmar, does each one have their own little kingdom, and then Kaf is just like the king of kings?
Yeah, 100%. So
they pay tribute to him.
You're ruling a planet. I mean, if you think about it, you're ruling a planet that's bigger than our own. Think about 13 kings trying to just rule Earth alone.
Yeah.
And just the pure size, the level of people they have to communicate with. Like, one ruler for all is extremely difficult on itself, and having 13 rulers it's impossible. So they would all have a hierarchy system. They would all be around pivotal points around the planet that would all run together.
Yeah.
But for them to all come together and basically return back to, Kraith's body, which is basically the capital is built there, that's where Kaf stays, is right over Kraith's body.
Right.
So for them to all come there is a huge deal. So
Is his capital built on the surface, or is his capital built within?
Over the entrance.
Over the entrance. Okay, so you basically have to fight through his kingdom to get to the entrance to go down
into the Dawasil, and even after you get there, you have to deal with the Dagroths that live in there. So it's a whole nother defense web that goes around that.
Well, the reading talks about like Temple Fortress. Yeah. How big is this place? It's in the caves, right? Is it within the second layer or something? So
it has walls within that cavity that goes down to where Kraith's body is, but the fortress is built up on top of that entry.
Okay.
So it's this huge, huge fortress, because if you think about it, if you have all the united hands of a planet working together to build a fortress, you're going to build a pretty spectacular fortress.
What's the time frame then from when Kaf fell to then Terrillian attacking the Darthmar? Like,
Kraith fell?
Yeah, when Kraith fell, how did this fortress come about, right?
So that when Kraith fell, and then eventually when the Darthmar race emerged from him, people were looking for leaders, and they stepped up to be those leaders. They rallied thousands upon thousands of people, and they also brought people up in their ranks that would become, the hierarchy, and then you had the Felice race that was born out of that relationship. And they basically formed this huge connection. But to answer your question more as far as time frames, thousands of years have gone by. And you think about how much we're able to build in like the course of 10 years, skyscrapers and cities, 10 years, and we build these huge monuments and things like that. Imagine if you had the dedication of a human race / deity race that are able to lift these heavy things. You could build an empire. And that's what they did. They built an empire. They had their people build an empire over the most important place first, which would be the entrance to Kraith. They built there first, and then they built little stations around the planet.
Cool. Okay.
I think that's all the questions I got for this chapter.
I like these
I
questions.
do have a question.
Yeah.
So when I was helping you kind of go over the reading, I guess can you just like describe what the Dawasil is? I know it's like a source of power, but I think like I have the mental block where it's like you describe as like a sluggish thing. Like what?
Sludge.
Sludge.
Is it a pool of sludge?
What is it?
The physical manifestation of the Dawasil is like a sludgy pool.
So like when he gets power from it, does he just like poke a thing of jello and is like, wow, I'm so strong? Like how does this work? Like I think that's where my mental block
I actually
is.
have a mental image of the queen from the Snow White and the Huntsman movie.
Where she like emerges herself into the big thing of white liquid.
Yeah.
Kind of like that, I would say, would be probably the most accurate way to describe it.
Okay.
Like, think of it like a battery getting recharged.
But he absorbs it?
He absorbs it. Think about it, you know how you have, like, this sounds really car-y, but there's different kinds of chargers for cars now. There's a slow charger and a fast charger.
Sure.
So the Dawasil is accessed in 2 major points. You can either do it through, like, the actual magic system where you make a physical connection to it and you actually are in it. And that will basically supercharge the person who's in it or kill them, depending on who it is. Now, in the event of Kath, now, Kath is not going to have a single issue with going in there. That's where he came from. Darthmars don't have a problem with that. They can supercharge in there all day and not have an issue.
But if you're
Okay.
supercharged as a normal person, normal user...
It would kill you.
Right. Okay.
So people find ways of adapting themselves to it bit by bit so that way they don't get overrun. So the whole burn-in or magic system is basically done through that, where they don't have to be in physical touch of it. They can access it through the magic system in the game. So
Okay.
it's not like you have 2 different ways of getting there, essentially. And then as the game progresses, people develop different ways to get it more effectively and less effectively.
I think the other question then I had was, it's described as like a familiar thing. Like I know that's their birthplace, but was that like from day one their home?
That's where they emerged out of / figured out what and who they were. So yeah, for a while that was a home. If you could even call it that. Kind of like an egg is for an animal. You know, like a snake has an egg, and it's in that egg. For them, that is their home for the majority of their life. They're already sentient, but they're there. And that's where they stay.
And they still refer to it as like their like place.
That's their
Because it's referred
birthplace.
to
That's
as
the
like
cradle.
a holy place.
Yeah.
Resting
like, kind
place.
of resting place.
It is the beginning of their entire species. So yeah, it is extremely important to them.
With that, we will draw to a close. We do appreciate all of you who have listened to our comprehensive discussion of the planet known as Terrillian. We entice you to listen and learn, following along with each podcast, so that you will visualize the vivid and vast world of Terrillian. A tragic tale set forth for the main protagonist, where you as the gamer would play to conquer lands and legends, thus creating a lore of your own. In doing so, we hope to gain your favor to turn these stories into a video game. If you want to see more content, check out our website at terrilliangaming.com. For more episodes, find us on Spotify and YouTube. Support our emergence.